There we go. So I'm excited to introduce you today to Working with International and Undocumented Students, a webinar for folks under Enough is Enough working with campus populations to really bring some ideas about how can we make sure that we're doing this work in an intentional, culturally responsive way, but also not treating international and undocumented students as a monolith that is unfortunately so often done in kind of preliminary attempts to address these populations. So as I mentioned, this is brought to you by the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault in partnership with the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We work with the Department of Health on a number of training and technical assistance needs and are always happy to work with folks on an individual basis. So if you would like to connect with us through any individual work for your program, please feel free to go ahead and reach out to us. This information will also be at the end of the training. So today's agenda, I'm going to touch a little bit on why this topic is important to address, and then we're going to dive deep into a case study about what primary prevention can really look like outside of a one-off training space. And I'm really encouraging folks to think about how to extend their primary prevention work beyond the workshop model. So we're going to be hearing from Dara at Binghamton about how she's used an existing prevention program and adapted it to make sure that it fits and is accessible to international students. And one of the things I'm really excited to hear from her about is the community needs assessment that she did by using focus groups. And she'll also be talking about successes and lessons learned so that folks can replicate some of this work. We'll then be hearing from Trin Tran about legal considerations for working with international undocumented students. Although it is the responsibility of direct service providers and advocates to connect with legal services on these issues, we also think it's critical for folks to really have some background and some information so that they can be providing their student survivors guidance and helping them make informed decisions. And finally, I'm going to speak a little bit about on-the-ground considerations for working with students, both tips for creating accessible prevention programming and some additional barriers for international student survivors that many folks maybe just don't even think about if they haven't had these experiences and hold these identities. But communicating to an international student survivor that you understand what they're going through can be really key to kind of developing their trust and building that relationship. So really quick, I just have one question to get us started, and I wanted to ask folks if they could turn back to their screen if they've been typing away on email and answer this question about your current level of work with international and undocumented student populations. So whether you already use targeted programming or use your own targeted programming, if you're developing targeted programming, if you're planning on addressing these populations and not sure how to address these populations. And I did make this multiple choice, so if more than one of these is relevant for you, please go ahead and reply with more than one. I'm just going to give folks a minute. Okay, so it seems that most people are definitely planning on working with these populations. I'm excited to have you join us. And there's still a little bit of confusion about what the best methods are, and that's something we're going to be diving into today. So thank you folks so much for joining us for this important conversation. So a little bit about our presenters. Dara is a senior counselor and co-founder of the 2021 program at Binghamton University, where she also coordinates the mental health outreach peer education program. Her areas of expertise include sexual trauma, sexual assault prevention, bystander intervention, and bereavement. Dara has done extensive training and consulting with both staff and students nationally and internationally about sexual assault prevention, and we're really excited to hear her talk about how she's adapted an existing program, because I think most of us are already working with something but don't necessarily have the tools or the knowledge to be able to make sure that it's applicable and accessible for our international and undocumented student populations. We're then joined by Trin Tran, who is the Supervising Staff Attorney at Saatiotu Center for African Women and Families, which is a community-based organization that provides culturally and linguistically appropriate services to African immigrants. Trin manages their legal service program, which provides civil, legal, and immigration services to low-income immigrants and survivors of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, forced marriage, and trafficking. We're also lucky to have Trin's perspective as she serves on the Advisory Council on Immigration Issues in Family Court and the Advisory Council on Language Access, and is a member of the Lawyers Committee Against Domestic Violence. So thank you both so much for joining us. I'm going to turn over to Dara now, and she's going to talk a little bit about why and how we can manage creating more sustainable primary prevention programming for this population. We know that a one-off workshop is not enough, and we know that New York State has such a diverse student population with one of the highest percentages of international students in public schools in the country. So combined with this political climate, it's so crucial for us to be focusing on working with these students in a sustainable and an intentional way. And I'm excited to turn it over to Dara to give us some tips and tools as to how.
Hi, thank you very much, and thank you for a wonderful introduction, and I'm so happy to be here to talk about this important topic. So I am the co-founder and coordinator of the 20 to 1 program at Binghamton University, which started as a fraternity men talking to fraternity men program. It's a peer education program. And we started in 2004, and over the years we've had to look at what groups we want to address. So part of our model is not to have a one-size-fits-all program that we present to the general student body. So as I said, we started as a fraternity program with peer educators and have expanded over the years. So the question is, why did we want to focus on international students as well? So there's a couple reasons for that. One of the reasons is that we have looked at all of our sub-communities and thought about how can we reach out to these communities. So we have expanded, and we do programming for athletics, for our multicultural orgs, our LGBTQ groups, and so we wanted to reach out to international students as well. Some of our decision making in how and when we reach out to what group is based on the research. We look at the research that will give us an idea of what's happening, but also we look at what we know is happening on our campus. I have the advantage of being a therapist, and for many, many, many years here at Binghamton University, half my time is spent doing clinical work, primarily with in sexual trauma, and then the other half of my time has been spent doing outreach programming. So one of the things that I noticed as a counselor was that when I would work with victims, I was hearing similar things in terms of who was perpetrating these crimes. And so there were sort of 2-3 main groups that I was hearing about over the years. And one was fraternity houses, which we knew, but the other was that the perpetrator was an international student. So I thought about, okay, how do we address international students? And I got in touch with our International Student Services program, and they were sort of aware of the same thing, both in terms of sexual violence and domestic violence. So then we had to think, well, the program we have, could it be adapted for international students? And so we really didn't know, because we had this program that we had adapted for other groups, but we weren't sure if this program would work for international students. So we did focus groups, and so if you haven't done focus groups, I think it's really important to do focus groups with whatever group you want to do presentations with or to do outreach with. we had done focus groups very early on with fraternity men, sorority women, and then did focus groups with athletics. So any group that we have wanted to do presentations for, we do focus groups. So the way we typically have recruited for our focus groups is through whatever existing structure there is. So, for example, if there is, when we worked with our LGBTQ students, we asked them to put out the word for our focus groups, and then we got a core group of students for those. For international students, we talked to our international students office, and they brought together a group of students for us. And it went really well. We asked questions around how do they understand consent, because this is very important in terms of what approach then would be taken. Did they even think this was an important dialogue to have with international students? So we asked a lot of questions around that and had a lot of dialogue. And then we asked about cultural barriers to dialogue. The majority of our students are from China, India, Korea, and Turkey. And so we wanted to make sure that we understood what cultural barriers might exist. And so that's a very important thing, is to not only be aware of where your students come from at your institution, but also what are the cultural barriers to talking about prevention. We asked them what a successful program might look like. And we asked this with each group that we've done focus groups, and we've gotten different answers, whether it's international students, fraternities, athletics. And so we've had to adapt our program to what they are telling us works. So for us, it's been really important in our success to really listen to the students in these focus groups with what they have to tell us. We also asked about help seeking and bystander intervention, and how those things are perceived, and what might be a successful way to address those issues. That was something that I felt was really important, having worked with women from different countries who had been victimized, and trying to do creative ways to seek help. Because oftentimes someone might feel that the people from their country of origin may shun them, the students, but also when they go home, or there might be some retaliation. So it's very important to look at that. One of the things, I know one student, there was a professor from her country of origin who she trusted very much, and she wanted to bring him into the dialogue, and that was how we were able to get her safety plan done and get her in a safer, more protected place. So that was a creative thing that, you know, I think as a therapist we don't always think of, but it was nice that the student was able to identify this person. So in terms of what we learned from these focus groups and what worked, is what we learned from our international students is they didn't feel that presentations would be helpful. And this was for a variety of reasons, but partly they felt that it would be very hard to get groups of international students to want to come to a presentation. They thought there would be a language barrier, it would be difficult to understand. We heard over and over again that mixed gender would be problematic, and I'm going to talk about that a little later, because it has been problematic in some ways in terms of engaging our women in dialogue. And so we learned a lot about this approach and what we should do instead of doing our traditional presentations. And so there were suggestions about meeting students where they are. So we have residence halls that are primarily international students in them, although not 100%. So we talked about how we could engage residential life in that programming. there's an International Student Coffee Hour once a month. And that tends to be more heavily attended by our graduate students. But over the years, our graduate population for international students has increased, and is actually, we have more graduate student international students than undergrad. So that was a good place for us to focus some of our energies. And then we talked about what we would do at these things. And so we talked about interactive tabling games and having game nights. So 20 to 1, in addition to our presentations, we've developed these games to get people to come to tables at large tabling events. And they're very interactive. There's a game, it's spin the wheel, there's a number that corresponds with a question. Our questions are more scenario-based, so they're really about creating a dialogue and having discussion. So they're not, a statistic or a yes or no kind of answer. So it's very much an interactive dialogue. And so that's what we did. We ended up doing game nights in the residential communities at night. We went to coffee hour with our interactive games, and so that has been very successful for us. Also, social media. We've used social media quite a bit, and but we use social media that the International Student Office uses. So so they post our posters or put up our videos for the international students to see. And that way we're reaching more international students that might just not come to these other events, but might go on social media. But in that, one of the things we also learned was about language. And so we had to take out slang from some of our programs, and because what we were told is that some of our students won't understand what these things mean, or may have completely different meanings for some of them. So we had to be careful about language. And I know that one time I was doing the tabling at an international student's part of their orientation for graduate students, and had to explain to a male who was from a Muslim country, had to explain what oral sex was, because we were talking, the question was about proceeding from one form of sex to another. So actually the dialogue went really well, but it was just an interesting moment for me to understand that, the term oral sex may not necessarily be a common term. So I wanted to talk about some of our challenges. And so, as I said earlier, the gender issue has been a challenge for us. And so, so when we do our tabling events, what we have found is that men feel more comfortable coming to our table and playing the game and answering questions than the women do. And I think some of this, or a large part of it, has to do with the topic, but also about men and women mixing in these dialogues. So one of the things we did, for example, that was suggested in the focus group, was to not have our table covers say sexual assault prevention, but instead just say 20 to 1 programs, so that the word sexual was not there, which could be a taboo word. So there were these sort of subtle things that I would have never thought of. And so, as I said, men tend to come to our table. What we did with coffee hour, because we get a large number of students who come to coffee hour each month, but the women may stay at the table. So what we did was we had some of our female interns go and sit at the tables and play the game at the tables, as opposed to hoping that they would come to the table. So that was one of the things we did. Another challenge is just continuing this dialogue in an in-depth way. It's we're not sure what our next step is. This is all pretty new for us, and so although we feel we've had some successes, we don't know what the next step is. And we're really interested in going to a deeper level for this. And the other challenge is, how do you measure success? So with presentations, we have our pre and post surveys that we use to measure success, but we don't have that for interactive tabling. All we have is the ability to count numbers of, we have clickers where we can count numbers of if we had a meaningful dialogue with someone. So that's another challenge, but I feel like this is, we're pretty new in this as well. So I always talk about this when I present, but this is really important, just to think about a comprehensive prevention program, regardless of the groups that you're working with, so that peer-to-peer we have found to be extremely successful, and we see that on our pre and post surveys. With international students, we have found it to be extremely successful, and that was one of the things we heard in the focus groups, was that even though these are peers, because they're interns, they would be looked up to by our international students as already being in some amount of authority. So they're what we would call near peers. And so if we went to a level higher than that, where they were staff people delivering this information, the thought was that they would not feel comfortable talking about this. And so we've been very successful using peer-to-peer programming with our students. I know I'm just about out of time, so one tip I just want to say is, if you don't have someone on campus who's doing both counseling and outreach like I am, it might be really helpful to have a talk with your advocates or case managers or counselors, and to talk in general about trends they're seeing, so you can really get a sense of what's happening. Because oftentimes, obviously because of confidentiality, you may not even know that these trends are happening. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and then we can answer questions at the end of the presentation. And so now I believe Trin is taking over. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dara. That was really helpful, and I think kind of you touched upon a really critical part, that we're essentially, even though this is a training and a webinar, we're all kind of creating the path by walking it right now. And we're trying to figure out what the best strategies are and what the successful strategies are. And I think hearing about challenges is critical as folks start to think about creating their own programs. And I'm going to talk a little bit in my section after Trin's presentation about kind of tips for creating your own primary prevention programs. But in the meantime, as Dara mentioned, if folks want to type their questions into the Chatbox function, and also type any successes or challenges you've had working with international and undocumented student populations into the Chatbox function as well, and we can have a discussion at the end of the training. So now shifting gears from primary prevention, I want us to think a little bit more about intervention services, and Trin is going to talk to us about the legal perspective and the legal considerations to bear in mind.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, or good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to share and connect with everyone here. So I mentioned an attorney at Sautia Center for African Women and Families, and we're located in the Bronx, working with a very diverse and growing African American communities here. We work with individuals, children, families, youth on various social and legal issues. And so I was really happy to be invited to talk about kind of thinking about legal issues that international and undocumented students might encounter, and immigration programs that they might be eligible for. And so I guess I kind of want to start first with kind of definitions, and who we're talking about, and words that I'm using. And so with international students, I think generally want to think about international students who for other countries, and the difference of like non-immigrant status and immigrant status. So many international students that are here in the United States enter on as with a non-immigrant status, right? So they're here in the United States on a temporary basis for study. And so their intent is that they will return to their home country after their studies. And that's how they remain with their non-immigrant status. And then when you talk about immigrant status or undocumented immigrant students, these are students who don't have illegal status here, so they're not U.S. citizens, they don't have a visa, they're not green card holders, and so these are undocumented students. And so I kind of just wanted to put those definitions out there first. So I'm going to go to our second slide here. It's different types of immigration relief that might be, people might be eligible for, and these, there are many different programs, immigration programs, but I just kind of wanted to highlight on these four that we see a lot here at Satya too, and I think might be remedies for international undocumented students. And so the first one is a VAWA self-petition and battered spouse waiver. And this is a specific program for individuals who are specifically the VAWA self-petition who are undocumented and are married to a U.S. citizen or a green card holder, and then during the marriage experience intimate partner violence or sexual assault, battery, and can gain their green card or legal permanent status without their spouse. So they don't need their spouse to petition for them. And so the requirement is really proving that you entered this marriage in good faith, that you resided together during the marriage, and that you suffered battery or extreme cruelty during the marriage. And just about marriage, I want to highlight that we have a lot of clients who have traditional marriages or proxy marriages, where they might be here in the United States, or their partners here in the United States, and they're in the home country, and family members might perform some type of customary marriage or religious marriage ceremony, and there might not be a marriage certificate, but they did practice take the steps of having a formal marriage according to their culture, and then we've been able to make arguments that those are still valid marriages, and these people entered into them in good faith. So just kind of thinking about, the idea of marriage in different cultures and communities, and how we try to make an argument to have clients be eligible for this program. The other program is special immigrant juvenile status, which we're seeing a lot, particularly in our work with high schools and also schools where it's students who are much older, like 20 years old, who are continuing their high school studies to get their GEDs. And so these are unmarried folks who are under 21 and are unable to be reunited with one or both of their parents due to abuse, abandonment, neglect, or even the death of one of the parents, and that it wouldn't be in the best interest of this individual to be returned to their country. And this is a status that eventually the individual will be eligible to apply to get a green card. And it's a complicated process in that it has to begin generally in family court, and then certain orders need to be granted by a judge. And then if you have all those orders, you can apply for this immigration status. And so we've seen a lot of young people who have either been brought to the United States and just left here by a family member or a parent, and are on their own and really have no one to support them or guide them in their life. And so we've been able to work with them to get guardians who can help make all these important decisions in their lives until they're 21, and then apply for this immigration status before they age out. Another program, it's deferred action for childhood arrivals, which right now is a program that recently the administration said that it was going to keep, but the future of it is still unknown. And I think, I highlight the number because of just what a huge number of people were able to benefit. So that's and these are undocumented folks who are able to have DACA status and be able to remain in the United States and work. And many here, even in New York, are able to get specific scholarships and go to school because they aren't eligible for applying for financial aid through FAFSA. But there's very specific requirements. You have to enter the United States under the age of 31 before 2012. When you entered the United States, before you were 16 years old, have to have lived here. There's a lot of specifics. And so we really tell folks that if they haven't applied for DACA before, to really consult with an attorney, because they would now be presenting themselves to immigration and basically saying that they've been here without status. The last programs I wanted to highlight are UNT non-immigrant status applications. And so this is for people who are victims of crime and have suffered from that crime or have been trafficked into the United States. And so my next slide is going to focus a little bit more on non-immigrant status. And so, like I said, this status is particularly for people who are victims of a crime, have either suffered physical or mental abuse from this crime, and then cooperated in the investigation of the crime. What is something that's required of this application is that in your cooperation, that the investigative agency needs to sign a form that says that you cooperated in an investigation. And so certain of those agencies might be a judge. If someone goes and files for an order of protection, it could be the district attorney's office when you are a witness in a crime that you were a victim of, and provide testimony, provide description and statements, coming and looking at photos of people, of potential perpetrators. That is the forms of cooperating. The NYPD, especially here in New York, different police stations, law enforcement is also a certifying agency. So filing a police report, going and meeting with a detective, and providing your statement and evidence of the crime that you're a victim of. And I also wanted to highlight specifically in New York that the New York Commission on Human Rights is also a certifying agency, and they've really, it's kind of been a big game changer in terms of providing more people the opportunity to be eligible for this status, because so many people have been victims of discrimination, either based on their race, their religion, sexual orientation, discrimination in the workplace. And so the Commission on Human Rights, if you file a complaint with them, will investigate your complaint, and if you continue to cooperate, would be able to sign a certification. And a certification is required as part of the visa application, and if you don't have one, you can't submit the application. And so what are these type of crimes? Kind of the main ones that I'm listing here are sexual assault, domestic violence, rape, torture, stalking, abduction. And so you have to have been a victim of one of these crimes and others to qualify for this status. And the main thing I want to highlight, I think sometimes there might be misconceptions about like how easy it might be to apply for a U status and then also to get a U visa, but it's actually it can take a long time, because every year the government only grants 10,000 U visas, and this is in the whole United States. And so we have many clients who have been on a wait list, have been waiting to get on a wait list for over a year, and then remain on the wait list for more than a year before they can get the U visa status. And once you have the U visa status for 3 years, as long as you've proven, presence in the United States and haven't engaged in the criminal system for like serious crimes, then you can adjust and get your green card. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is just the barriers to report, and so why people, international students or undocumented students, may not want to report crimes, especially sexual assault or intimate partner violence. And so just these are kind of different topics. Even I think Dara highlighted them as well, and it's just fears that people might have of, when you are in school or when you're on campus, you think about a high school, that you might see this person all the time, right? And as we know, generally the person who commits these, the perpetrator is often someone that you already know. And so think of someone you're going to see, at sixth period, or at the community hall, or at a Greek, a fraternity or sorority meeting, and that person is there. And so the networks that person might use to retaliate against you could be a barrier of why you don't want to report. We have pressures of family pressure. Maybe this individual grew up in a home where talking about these issues, talking about these issues was a taboo, and so not feeling that they can express this, and if their family got involved, and how their family would feel about that. The education requirements. I know that for international students, to maintain that immigrant visa, you have to have, be on full student caseload. And so if you're taking time off to, take care of yourself or to cooperate in the investigation, thinking about if you want to move schools, how that would happen, how that could be a barrier because these are too many changes and how it could impact you being able to continue your education with your particular type of visa. Other barriers, people, especially when what we see with folks who are eligible for the VAWA self-petition, who are undocumented and married, their spouse or partner has always said using their immigration status against them, right? Like if you report, no one's going to believe you, or go to the police and they'll arrest you because you're undocumented. And we really want to, these are real fears. We hear it all the time with our clients, and do our work to try to dispel and encourage people that these programs are here because we want to encourage people to seek help so that they are able to be safe for them and their families. There's also, I think Dara talked a bit, like just, what words are we using? I think there's kind of like more Western language maybe, or even slang, and how do you talk about being a big, something that happened to you? What words do you use? Finding someone that speaks your language so that they can understand you, and that safe space is really important. And maybe in some situations that individual might not feel like they can talk about this or talk about it to someone who really would understand them. As we know, there's so much guilt, humility that people feel on themselves, that the added barrier of not even being able to express these words to someone in your own language can really be a barrier. I also, want to highlight about confidentiality. Students might feel like, if I tell this professor or I tell this counselor, what are they going to do with the information? If the school has a kind of internal investigation that they do, how do I ensure that my information is protected, especially if I'm undocumented, or I'm worried about, what could happen with my information and the statements that I'm making. So I think that these are real things that people are concerned about and can prevent them from wanting to say actually what happened to them and seeking help. I always try to put in a slide about people's interactions with ICE, which is Immigration Customs Enforcement, because we want people to know that irrespective of your immigration status, whether you're here as an international student, an undocumented student, you have a right to remain silent and that you have a right to speak to a lawyer. These are constitutional rights that are for everyone, and we really encourage our clients and community members to use these rights. So we know that we tell people, to not lie. It's better to remain silent and to provide any information that might not be true. You don't have to share information about, your country of origin, what your immigration status is, where you go to school. We tell people to be really careful about not to give any of your personal information or documents to ICE if they approach you, and to be really wary of, conversations of, like, where you go to school, what did you do today, can you tell me about your friend, and do you know this person? And so we really tell people how important that right to remain silent is, because as we know, like, information that you provide could be used against you, and especially in this climate, we want people to be very aware of the interactions they have with ICE and that the rights that they have. Just in this slide, I wanted to talk a little bit specifically around CUNY and what the City University of New York has done, and kind of like the statements of where they're really going in the kind of putting out front that CUNY will protect their students' records and the compliance with FERPA, which is the Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And the chancellor really came out about how they're going to protect their students' information, that they will not provide information to ICE without judicial warrants, which are more difficult warrants to get, and that the CUNY will also not cooperate in providing ICE with any information about their students in terms of even where their students are located or their students' records. And so that's the schools really coming out front to say that we are here for our undocumented students and we will protect their confidentiality. So my last slide is about how thinking about all these things about barriers of reporting the different immigration programs that are available, very real fears that people are having now, and how do we work together to provide like these safe spaces where people can report, where people can seek help, so people can, ask questions. And I think one thing I've learned in my work here at Savtia too is the importance of working in collaboration. Attorneys can really get just in our silo of the legal issues, but when we work in collaboration with our partners in social workers, teachers, caseworkers, parents, everybody, that we are able to provide much more substantive support to our students and community members. And so just even thinking about having, cross-sector meetings where Dara talked about, you can talk about trends, like what you're seeing, what I'm seeing in our different kind of professions and interactions, but creating spaces for us to hear the different issues that we are interacting with our clients and community members, and then working together to provide the best support for each individual that we're working with. And of course, recognizing that there is the confidentiality. And so I think when we have cross-sector meetings, we really don't talk about specific people, but just hypotheticals or situations that we're hearing, so we can better learn from each other about what's going on. So I think that's it for me, and I'm happy to answer any questions beforehand. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Trin. That was really illuminating. I was scribbling furiously. And to kind of be aware of time, I wanted to keep us moving forward. If folks can continue sending questions through the Chatbox function, we'll get to them at the end. And I now just wanted to provide a few kind of takeaways for folks who are really trying to start doing this work and applying some of these ideas ASAP, so that people can really start including these two populations in your programming. So thinking about accessible primary prevention, one thing that I find from a lot of the focus groups of international students I've done in the past few years, and from my own experiences as well, is that international and undocumented students often really don't know what services are available to them, both on and off campus. Kind of the assumption that like everybody knows about Planned Parenthood or something like that, or that's a place to go. These are not messages that really cross the borders that much. So you really need to think about what your responsibility as a campus advocate, as a rape crisis program provider, is to know the basics and to know where to refer other people, and to know how to connect them with different services. So in terms of collaborations with other services, kind of thinking about working with legal services like Trin talked about. It's also critical to ensure that your language is accessible. So something I try and encourage folks to do is to use descriptors as much as possible, including in your workshop title. So if you have a workshop title called like Know Your Title IX Rights, and it's a non-mandatory training and like everybody can come, how is an international student meant to know that Title IX is something that might be relevant to them, that it's not like something that I heard multiple times that really kind of broke my heart in focus groups has been, people said, I thought it was X. The title was X. Title IX meant nothing to me. I didn't know that was anything about gender equity or sexual violence. So having some sort of a subheading or a descriptor can be really important. And think about that with your office titles as well. So for folks who work with Title IX offices, the gender resource offices, think about encouraging them on any of their materials to have a small one-liner descriptor to make it a little bit more accessible. And then I wanted to flag the SUNY Saver resource that I will be sending out in the follow-up email to this presentation. It has a lot of resources translated into a lot of different languages, which is really critical. And while it's definitely not all the information that folks need, it's a really important start. And then I also wanted to think about how can we infuse prevention into existing policies. So we know that the student population is constantly changing. How can we make sure that the prevention programming we're doing is sustainable? So partnering with the International Student Office is going to be critical, but also engaging student leaders from multicultural orgs. They can be the people finding folks for your focus groups. They can be the people participating in some of these conversations and doing some of this peer-to-peer work. So I think the most important thing to do is to is to start. So if you haven't worked with this population before, connect with the International Student Office, connect with student leaders from multicultural orgs, and then try it out and then readapt from there, have a focus group to see how it went, and really kind of create the path by walking it. And also thinking about entry points in other topics. So is perhaps food or housing security a more pressing issue for your undocumented students on campus? Are there ways that you could connect with other programs doing presentations, doing trainings, and be able to reach more populations there by even doing kind of a quick intro and offering to come in to speak with the same group about a different topic? Something I really want to underscore is that orientation trainings that I've been a part of, that I've seen at schools across the country, can often be really harmful and are kind of the feeling that is really communicated to students that I've heard time and time again from students reporting back to me is that I felt like I was in the room because as an international student, it was assumed that I was a potential perpetrator because I didn't know kind of the American way of things and that my cultures were so different and so other. And kind of the feel has been really that international students can be presumed perpetrators because of where they're from. So you cannot make assumptions about international students, and by treating them as a monolith, you really end up kind of othering some students but infantilizing others, and it never really works. So thinking about how to adapt orientation programming so it's not for the entire incoming first-year class of international students, for example, or if there are ways to clarify that you know some of this isn't relevant, but here are some tools that we can give you regardless of your cultural background. So something that can be critical is expectations management and providing coping mechanisms or resources. So whereas some students who identify as international may be coming from Australia, for example, there might be some that are coming from countries in which their culture has taught them that, they're at a party and they're dancing, and that feels like a violation. How do you cater to both those audiences? And I think a way to do that without assuming and othering and kind of providing don'ts and do's is to give people some coping mechanisms and resources and then go into these multicultural student groups to do more in-depth, more appropriate trainings. One way is I also wanted to always plug the data. Use your climate surveys, use some needs assessments, connect with the International Student Office to send out a needs assessment about what they need. What do students need? What does the International Student Office need? Have they thought about this before? And then connect with the Title IX office or whoever is doing the climate survey for your campus partners and think about including some of these more specific questions for specific populations within the climate survey so you can start really using that data and integrating it. I'm sorry I'm rushing. I'm just aware of time. So a few things I wanted to note. Making an informed decision can be pretty difficult as an international or undocumented student, given that a lot of folks don't know about the resources, and this includes Title IX coordinators, deans, advocates, counselors. I personally was suggested to kind of take a leave of absence and was not told that that could result in my F1 student visa being jeopardized. So if I had taken up that suggestion, for example, I could have had my student visa taken away from me and then you have to fly home to apply for another one. So this kind of information is really critical, and the students are going to be so grateful if, as an advocate, you're able to provide this information, not to guide them in one way or another, but just to allow them to make an informed decision. So with that in mind, this can be a great entry point to offer trainings to Title IX coordinators, to deans, to counselors, and to your campus partners. Do they know this? Are they providing the accurate information? And how can you work with them to increase their knowledge about working with these populations? And kind of thinking about what both Dara and Trin have mentioned as well, considering different styles of communication. Encourage the folks on the ground working with international and undocumented student survivors to question the way they're asking the questions. Kind of saying what's wrong may not always elicit the response that you might expect if you've always been surrounded by a westernized American culture. I've noted a couple things here for considerations and additional barriers for undocumented students. little things that can feel really monumental when you're part of a big friendship group on a campus. But thinking about spring break travels, for example, like undocumented folks are not able to travel in the same way that citizens or even international students on visas are. So kind of having a little bit of an idea of some of these issues so that you're not an expert, but you're able to empathize and communicate to the international or undocumented student survivor that you're working with, that you understand that they're facing unique barriers and that you're here to support them. With international students as well, as Trin mentioned, there are education requirements, so you have to be taking a full course load. You are not allowed to take a reduced course load and still be on the F1 student visa. So that's something to think about when you're talking to people about their academic accommodations that are available to them. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't take time off, but it means that they need to think about it a little bit closely so they're not caught off guard at some point. There are also employment restrictions on the F1 student visa. So you're only allowed to work on campus. You cannot work off campus on the student visa, and that also impacts you. There are a few summer opportunities that you can take. So if somebody, for example, is living with their intimate partner who is their abuser, and they're living off campus and they want to save up some more money by taking an extra job so that they can move away, that might not be something that an international student can do. So that's something to bear in mind, again, when you're safety planning with folks, when you're talking through what their options are if you're working with these populations. And finally, I wanted to mention that this is something that I've seen catch people off guard with pretty catastrophic consequences, so just a quick plug that I want to make. Leaves of absence are still definitely an option if people want to take them, but it can result in your student visa being jeopardized or taken away, depending on the length of time that you leave. If you leave for a couple of weeks, that's fine, but if you leave for a full semester, you're no longer a full-time student by most standards, so that can impact your student visa. Oftentimes, something I heard from an international student just a couple of weeks ago, they were like, well, a return flight is cheaper, so that means that I was deciding straight away as I was desperately fleeing the campus, like, when will I be ready to come back? Can I come back? And it felt like a weightier decision than going somewhere within the States to stay with family or something like that. And obviously the financial barrier to an international flight is pretty significant. And something I hear a lot as well is just the increased isolation. Most people don't have international phone plans, so connecting with their parents back home while in the U.S. or leaving to go back home and trying to connect with their friends in the U.S. Can be difficult. And I've known of 2 cases now where somebody doesn't have any family in the U.S. and really needs to leave campus because they're still surrounded by their perpetrator, and by virtue of showing up at home, they had to disclose to their parents what happened, and their parents weren't happy with them trying to come back to school when they felt ready. So I'm not giving these as kind of reasons to not make any of these decisions. I'm just trying to underline that there are a lot of unique additional barriers that international and undocumented student survivors face that as advocates, as counselors, as Title IX coordinators, as rape crisis center professionals, it can be really critical to bear in mind just so that you are able to empathize, you're able to bring some of these up and maybe help them make an informed decision, or even maybe just to communicate that you understand some of these considerations that they're dealing with that maybe some other survivors might not be. So I know that was a whistle-stop tour, but I want to refocus everybody back a little bit. I just have 2 questions, and I wanted to ask a couple of post-test questions. I know that doing surveys afterwards is difficult. So if folks could quickly answer whether this webinar gave you the tools to create targeted programming for international and undocumented student populations. On like a Likert, strongly agree, disagree, not applicable, neutral. So you'll see how I put this before the question so that people would have to participate. Give people a couple more minutes. Great. And then just one more, asking if this webinar better equipped you to understand the unique barriers faced by international and undocumented students, and so provide direct services for them. So kind of prevention and an intervention ask. Couple more minutes, get another response or two. Great, thank you so much, folks. So now some questions. Dara, Trin, if you all want to unmute yourselves, we have a couple questions. I've seen that you've been answering some of them in the chat box, but we had a question for you, Dara. With your challenge that you mentioned with gender-specific programming, how did you find this impacted the queer LGBTQ international and undocumented student population? Did you find that their needs were still met, and how did you address this issue?
I think that's a great question. I don't know if their needs were met, only because we didn't have an identified group in that area. So we've done programming for our LGBTQ community, and we've done programming for international students. So I don't know, in any of those groups we could have had what you're describing, international students in the LGBTQ community. But I know we make a lot of effort in terms of, through our case management and the counseling center, to reach out to all groups on campus to make sure they know of services, resources, and in terms of counseling, case management for academic issues, so that there is a lot of programming to reach all groups on campus.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. We also had a question about whether or not either of y'all have worked with cases where a student on an F1 visa assaulted a partner of theirs on an F2 visa, so that's kind of a child or spouse or an F1. It was mentioned that this community is often kind of in the shadows and least discussed. So if either of you have thought about the intricate complications with that situation.
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry. I didn't hear the whole question.
So if you've worked with a case where an F1 student assaulted their partner who is on an F2 visa, which is a child or spouse visa of an F1 student. Okay. So essentially the partner who they abused is reliant on the abuser on the F1's visa.
Trin, I don't know if you have an answer for this. I'm not sure off the top of my head if I've had that exact situation.
I haven't had that exact situation, but I would say that if that person that was the victim could explore whether or not they would be eligible for a U visa if they reported the crime to a investigating agency. So they wouldn't qualify for VAWA because their spouse would not be a green card holder or a U.S. citizen, right? And so VAWA wouldn't be an option. But if they reported the crime, they suffered from the crime, and it has to be one of those qualifying crimes that I listed, then they could be eligible for or could explore their eligibility for a U visa.
Okay. I know we're at time, folks, and I can see that there are still a couple of questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save them and send them to our presenters. And if y'all are okay with responding to them by email, does that feel good to you, Trin and Dara?
Sure, that's fine.
Thank you so much.
That would be great.
Respect folks' time. So thank you, both of you. Thank you to everybody for participating. There's an eval survey as you close the webinar link. I know those can be frustrating, but if people can fill them out, that would be really helpful. And thank you again so much. We are looking forward to hearing about how y'all are using some of these tools to work more with these often forgotten populations. So thanks again, folks.